Delete the clause, barked Executor Dranex Vul, talon tapping against the dais with sharp finality. Earth's so-called non-aggression protocol is obsolete and insulting. Let it vanish as they did. No one interrupted him, not even the neutral blocks. The circular chamber of the organic assembly remained still, insulated in a heavy silence that carried not respect, but tolerance. Drenvex Vul's voice had weight, not because of wisdom, but because his fleets orbited 9 systems. And he was right, at least in the room's current mood. In the center of the assembly, light bands across the floor rotated slowly beneath the vaulted ceiling as the archive's containment unit descended. A dozen locking arms detached with metallic thuds. The archive core itself was unremarkable. A single cylindrical spindle, no taller than a seated being, its surface smooth and charcoal black, a relic left behind when Earth abandoned their seat nearly 50 years prior. High Marshal Tivak of the Ros Coalition leaned over toward his assistant, narrow eyes flicking to the Terran device. That's it? No encryption matrix? No predictive AI? Not even a defense barrier? No power signature at all, the aide muttered, eyes scanning the readouts on his slate. It's inert. Passive archival memory only, just documents. Tivak chuckled under his breath. That's what Earth left behind after all their defiance? A filing cabinet? Across the chamber, Ambassador Rollo Thane of the Servani Confederation remained quiet, his gaze locked on the archive. He didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He simply frowned. A detail that went unnoticed in the wave of growing disdain around him. His species had suffered no wars with Earth, nor had they ever broken contact when the Severance Accords ended the human experiment in diplomacy, and yet, he couldn't shake the unease crawling beneath his skin like a pressure shift before a storm. Executor Vul, came the voice of the chamber speaker, tired and flat. The motion is active. As per request, the archive shall be opened and translated for council review. You may begin with your redactions. About time, Dranex grunted, gesturing to the translation display above. Let's show this council the last, desperate whispers of a primitive race pretending to be more. With a shudder of static, the archive activated. Thousands of documents began scrolling across the upper chamber display. Treaties, trade pacts, incident records, trial transcripts. The files looked old. Some encoded in Earth's extinct bureaucratic structure, others in galactic common script. There were pages where entire paragraphs had been crossed out, marked with red overlays labeled unverified accusation, denied admittance. Others listed trade corridors Earth had abandoned but never retracted claim from. But none of it screamed threat. No war orders, no military coordination. This is it? Tivak asked aloud, exasperated. They brought this to a war council once, and we thought they were planning something dangerous. This is clerical waste. One of the delegates from the Venari wards laughed, a dry bark that rippled into a chorus of chuckles across the chamber. It spread like nervous release, like a theater crowd realizing the villain's final speech had no blade behind it. Even the archival officers posted along the chamber wall allowed themselves a smirk. You hear that? Another voice jeered. We spent 3 decades fearing a race that documented import tariffs on fungus grain exports. The laughter turned sharp. Not one delegate questioned why Earth would encode so much procedural redundancy. Not one of them noticed the shift in lighting along the archive space. Subtle, a near imperceptible hue shift, pulsing in a spectrum outside normal visual range. Not one of them felt the internal transmission key sequence quietly jump to the embassy uplink channels embedded throughout the chamber's floor. I motion we remove the non-aggression protocol from the charter entirely, Vul announced, loud now, sensing his advantage. Earth is no longer a participating member. Their clauses served no structural function in the assembly. They were placeholders at best. The motion passed without debate, 73-4. The few abstaining species said nothing. Rollo Thane didn't raise a vote. Let it be recorded, the chamber speaker stated flatly. Protocol, Terran non-aggression. Nullified and struck from the organic register. In the seat designated for Earth, dark, untouched for decades, the embedded console blinked once. No one saw it. Behind the delegates, the archive's central panel retracted softly, revealing a file structure that had not been visible before. The screen showed a single item, devoid of decoration or notation. Icarus read. But the council didn't see it. The heads-up displays reverted back to inactive rotation, the chamber's brightness returned, and the show, as far as they were concerned, was over. "Well," said Tivak, pushing to stand. "That settles that. I suppose Earth has officially retired from our politics. May their bureaucracy keep them warm in exile." Rollo Thane rose slower than the others. He didn't speak. His eyes remained on the archive for just a moment longer. There was no alarm, no movement, but something about the stillness of that core disturbed him more than a weapon would have. He had seen human systems before, messy, redundant, frustratingly slow by design. But this wasn't that. This wasn't inefficient. This was silent. As the delegates began filtering out, their footsteps echoing off polished stone, Drenix passed near Earth's old chair, scoffing as he walked by. This was their legacy? A broken treaty and a stack of historical trivia? He didn't see the timestamp update behind the black panel. He didn't feel the tremor that moved through the archive's internal inertia platform, and he certainly didn't know that Icarus Red had no need for alerts nor approval chains. It had waited exactly 47 years for a trigger. Now it had one. In less than 9 seconds, across 14,000 diplomatic devices and 300 treaty-bound terminals, compliance thresholds began to rewrite. But in the chamber itself, there was no flash, no scream. Just the soft sigh of climate regulators adjusting airflow. Just the sound of officials congratulating themselves on their wisdom. Just the tightening unease behind Rollo Thane's eyes as he turned once more to the archive and said, under his breath, "Maybe they didn't leave that behind. They planted it." No one answered him. The council had already moved on. At first, it looked like a routing error. Cargo manifest updates across the Lidax corridor began to desynchronize. Pilots reported docking instructions that didn't match their assigned lanes. Distribution centers flagged authorization mismatches for shipments that had been approved hours earlier. Warehouses, unable to decode the permissions, defaulted to quarantine mode. Traffic backed up. Minor at first, manageable. No one panicked. 6 hours later, 17 star systems reported identical failures. The docking protocols refused local override. Even the emergency merchant priority lanes guaranteed by assembly trade compacts became unreadable to internal scanners. Freighter captains were left orbiting empty ports, their cargo growing stale, their contracts frozen in the dead air of unanswered jurisdiction queries. Counselor Ren Vaskin of the Tau Krill Consortium leaned over his data technician, tapping the side of the slate with 2 knuckles. "Explain to me how 8 independent supply chains collapse in one rotation." The technician's brow glistened as he glanced over line after line of reauthorization command sequences. Every error leads to the same key sequence. It's not an attack. There's no intrusion record. It's like the system changed the locks and never told anyone. Changed to what? Old Earth codes, the tech muttered. Or at least something built from them. It's rerouting access permissions to dormant legal clauses, obsolete ones, signed before the severance accords. Vaskin's hands froze above the terminal. "You mean the ones we nullified 50 years ago?" The tech nodded slowly, visibly swallowing. On the other side of the assembly's central hub, a broadcast screen flickered between footage of anchored trade convoys and a growing list of planetary emergency declarations. Stock exchanges shuttered themselves in automated cycles. Payment channels blinked to zero, despite there being no theft, no unauthorized withdrawals, no breach. The Council had always prided itself on redundancy, fail-safe systems layered in bureaucratic knots to prevent dependency, and yet, here they stood. watching it all unravel under the weight of unseen hands pulling levers no one remembered leaving installed. High Executor Drenex Vol stood before a room of military analysts, most of whom were locked in denial. The air archive was junk, one officer insisted, fingers splayed across a star map of the Delvanar routes. We saw the documents ourselves. They were dead paper. Then why is every bonded port treating those dead papers like law? Vol snapped, eyes sharp, voice stripped of rhetoric. Why are treaty withdrawal forms we haven't used in a generation suddenly activating force limits on civilian engines? No one answered. A junior strategist stepped forward, teeth clenched as he slid a secondary monitor toward the table. We found something in the Assembly's translation node logs. It's embedded, not separate. A parsing directive rerouting all compliance resolutions to an unlisted authority tag. And it's signed Earth Auth, the strategist said. Not just the tag. The terminal node identifies itself using Earth's final diplomatic signature. Still active. Bull stared at the screen, his jaw grinding once before he spoke again. And who gave it permission? Us, the strategist admitted. It was ratified into the Concord shared lexicon architecture. We never revoked the diplomatic parsing layer. It didn't need to hack anything. It's just executing. In orbit above Ceres Prime, transport ships began to drift, not from damage, but from disconnect. Their navigation arrays looped endlessly between system requests and automated declines. Power consumption escalated as processors throttled to process incompatible instructions. Pilots attempted manual override, but found their internal control trees had defaulted to non-dominant legal compliance mode. The ships weren't locked out, they were obeying laws, reactivated without notice. In the assembly chamber, Ambassador Rollo Thane watched the main display without blinking. His colleagues argued. Some shouted. Others demanded an emergency vote to revoke any remaining clauses that bore Earth's signature. But Thane watched the map of growing dead zones not with anger, but with the awareness of a man who had once seen a pressure door seal before an explosion. He didn't know what Icarus Red was, but he now believed it existed. He finally spoke, cutting through the noise. We're not under attack. Dozens of faces turned toward him. This isn't sabotage. These are protocols. Legal structures embedded in infrastructure we helped them build. Earth isn't invading. It's resuming authority. Someone scoffed. Authority over what? Their seat is empty. Thane's reply came without emotion. Over everything we link to that archive. Not far from the chamber, in a lower command tier, tech supervisors began running blind diagnostics. Centralized access keys were returned null. Not denied. Null. It meant the system had nothing to compare their credentials against, because the route tables were no longer local. They'd been shifted, repointed. All requests now needed Terran-level clearance. Admiral Cross Veld of the Dreven Accord kicked over his data stand. This isn't random. They're targeting only those of us who signed the severance accords. All non-signatories? Fully operational. That detail landed like ice. A pattern. Not chaos. Earth wasn't disrupting the galaxy. Earth was isolating its betrayers. The room quieted. In dozens of systems, commerce lines collapsed without a single hostile fleet. Military outposts remained docked. No warships entered orbit. No broadcasts blared ultimatums. Only silence. And lockout. In the void where Earth's signal had once traveled, there was nothing. No response. No denial. No acknowledgement. Drenex Vol stood in front of a hollow slate showing collapsed nodes across the outer rings. His claws flexed against the table's edge as the reality began to settle into his bones. We opened the archive, he whispered, barely audible. And they didn't fire a weapon. They rewrote the structure that held our world together. His aide hovered close, voice low with dread. Should we prepare a countermeasure? To what? Vol replied bitterly. We can't bomb compliance protocols. Still, there was no statement from Earth. Not a whisper. Only their laws remained. Active, Absolute. And closing in, Dranex Vol slammed the analysis slate onto the command table, sending shards of data glass scattering across the floor. He didn't even look down. Around him, the war room buzzed, not with energy, but with friction. Every officer in the chamber wore the same look, concentration crushed under pressure. "The relays are dormant," growled Sub-Commander Core. "No signal, no relay confirmation, no reaction from Earth. We've deployed 43 skirmish drones to the lunar lattice, 0 resistance. They're not hiding a thing up there." Bull stepped forward, claws clicking against the slate remnants as he leaned over the central display. Earth rotated slowly in the projection, blue, dispassionate, silent. The orbital scan overlay showed static orbitals, no movement. The satellites were there, dead, old, shells. Nothing fed into them. What about the thermosphere layer? Vol's tone was low now, less accusation, more autopsy. "Same," Core muttered, eyes darting between screens. "No relay arrays, no modulating towers, no quantum beacons. The old satellite web's been defunct for decades. We verified down to ground sensor sweep. Their network isn't on Earth." A cold sweat formed under Vol's brow as the implication grew heavier. "Then where is it?" Across the chamber, Admiral Thraxon approached, his voice clipped. "We believe it isn't located anywhere. Not in the physical sense." "Explain," Vol snapped, stepping into the dimly lit control corridor as the chamber auto-suggested private mode. Thraxon didn't hesitate. "We've traced the rerouted command strings in our disrupted systems. They all lead back to systems embedded in foreign embassies. The archive wasn't just a database, it was a carrier. It seeded legal executables inside our own networks, buried inside translation layers and diplomatic compliance packages." Vol stared at him, unblinking. "eBay's weaponized protocol?" "No," Thraxon corrected, tapping the side of the command frame. "They didn't need to. We gave their protocols permanence by legal ratification 76 cycles ago. The Zaron was never a central AI. It's a decentralized executor. It operates wherever compliance law is accepted." "Then kill it," Vol barked. "Purge every node that contains Earth code." Thraxon's jaw tightened. "We can't. It's interlinked through shared sovereignty permissions. Revoking them would strip our systems of legal operating basis. Our own ships would shut down." Outside the war room, the fleet staging corridor flickered as command authorization packets failed to deploy. Orders looped without dispatch. Tactical simulators wouldn't engage. Redacted by what appeared to be internal policy rejection. It wasn't sabotage. The systems believed they were following protocol. Vol marched back to the center of the room, voice steady but deep with rage. "Activate a ground team. Target every active Earth embassy. I want every one of those installations neutralized within the hour. Cross dozens of assembly-controlled planets, strike units mobilized." In the heart of Varnek Station, a perimeter unit breached the Earth consulate's gate without warning. They encountered no resistance. The interior was sterile. No personnel, no defense turrets, not even power signatures above passive regulation. But inside the central consulate hall, glowing white letters hovered mid-air, carved into the entry display with brutal finality. Clause 3.1a, Diplomatic Territory Invaded. Compliance override pending. Back on the command deck, alerts poured in. "What is this?" Vol snapped, glaring at the cascading status indicators. Admiral Thraxon leaned closer to the data feed. "Our own systems just reclassified the strike as a treaty violation. By protocol, jurisdiction authority is being reassigned." "To who?" Vol already knew the answer before he asked. "Earth." Across Kyrex-controlled space, command consoles began logging out fleet marshals. Bridge access shifted. Communications relays rerouted. Tactical net authority transferred to an external protocol source. It didn't take over their systems. It convinced them to obey it. Bull turned slowly to Core. "Lock out every remaining access route. Disable our internal law enforcement net. Revoke legal routing from planetary command." Core didn't move. "I said lock it." Kor's throat bobbed, his fingers frozen above the command pad. It's already gone. Even internal revocation requests bounce. Vol's voice dropped into a dry whisper. They've turned every legal code we ever passed into a weapon. Thraxon stepped beside him. It's worse than that. They haven't activated a system. They've activated us, through ourselves. Static jolted through one of the war room's secondary command feeds. A new symbol appeared, projected above their staging array. It wasn't Earth's old planetary crest. It wasn't military. It was the archive's sigil. Black circle, broken ring, 3 lines bisecting the center. Icarus, active. What does that mean? Someone asked from the shadows. No one answered. Vol closed his eyes for a beat, head tilting toward the ceiling as if it might offer escape. Then he opened them and spoke, low but certain. We're not dealing with conquest. We're dealing with containment. The command room trembled, not from weaponry, but from a shift in authority. It wasn't chaos. There were no explosions, no alarms, just order. Redirected, rewritten, reinforced. Systems began returning to operation, not because control had been retaken, but because control had been accepted, under Earth compliance law. In the outer corridor, a single diplomatic relay flashed to life. It had no antenna, no comms beacon, just an interface. And a message. Acris read clause enforcement, continuing. No demands, no apology, no statement from Earth, only silence, and systems that now served it. You are not authorized to revoke this protocol, the judicial assistant read aloud, her voice cracking in disbelief as the verdict appeared in full view behind her. Authority superseded by Terran-level compliance. The chamber fell quiet, not from order, but from paralysis. No one moved. The override code they had spent hours composing, backed by 7 system judges and signed by 2 charter overseers, had bounced back, unrecognized. Not denied, not overruled, nullified. Chief Arbiter Delvor stood, face drained of color, fingers still suspended above the tribunal seal. That's not possible, he said, slowly turning toward the council rows. This code originated from the Executive Forum. Earth doesn't even hold a chair. That's what makes it worse, murmured Archivist Hethron from the lower bench, lifting his eyes from his scroll. They didn't input an override. They built the table that decides which overrides count. A collective shift rippled through the room, robes brushing polished stone, boots shuffling in constrained disbelief. The assembly had never been challenged legally, militarily, yes, politically, often. But law was their fortress. Every agreement, every fleet movement, every docked vessel operated within signed intergalactic statutes. Until now, no one questioned who wrote the formatting system that validated those statutes. Suddenly, the chamber doors opened without ceremony. Commander Farkin of the Torvis sector strode in midsection, his face flushed, breath clipped. The Port Authority of Narlis Prime has locked our cargo lanes. 46 commercial ships held in orbit. Their systems tagged our vessels as non-compliant. We issued every correct manifest. They don't care. On what grounds? Dallowell asked, barely containing his temper. Legacy charter conflict, Farkin replied bitterly. Apparently, our trade ships inherit outdated Earth compliance tags because of a clause ratified when Narlis received reconstruction aid 71 cycles ago. The clause auto-invoked Earth's trade precondition matrix. He dropped the evidence panel onto the nearest lectern. It was glowing in red. Access denied. Compliance layer, Terran level 1. No protest rose this time. Back in the administrative wing, whispers passed faster than orders. Staff members who once handled diplomatic transit began requesting off-world transfers. Several went silent entirely, their clearance revoked without explanation. In one terminal corridor, the screen inside a transit lift flashed white, then black, then rebooted into a legal compliance confirmation form. Bearing the Terran archive insignia, Rollo Thane watched it happen. He stood quietly beside a junior delegate, fumbling with a faulty badge reader, the device stuck in a loop, demanding Earth verification, despite the user never having been assigned Terran files. "I didn't even interact with the archive," the young man said, sweat forming along his temple. "I've only been here 3 years. You were confirmed under the Shared Judiciary Accord," Thane said quietly. "That puts you under the procedural zone Earth helped draft. It doesn't matter what you touched, you're already included." Elsewhere, the Dreven Coalition attempted a mass unregistration of their fleet systems. They gathered every registration ID, broadcast revocation notices across Assembly airspace, and severed their ties from any Earth-Sand Treaty documents. Within 40 seconds, their command consoles began rejecting local access. The system hadn't been disconnected, it had reclassified them. The purge request flagged itself as non-compliant, under active Terran review. Admiral Vex Talun stared at the report in silence, his personal registry now labeled Earth-Traced, Invalid Sovereign Override. He didn't speak. He stepped into his quarters, sealed the door, and removed the command sigil from his collar. His assistant found him 2 hours later. He hadn't left the room. They wouldn't. In the Assembly's Crisis Response Wing, a private tribunal was held. Emergency override authority was invoked. The goal was simple: sever all system-wide links to Terran compliance structures by brute administrative nullification. The plan required unanimous vote and was only legal under the Archival Conflict Clause, one not used in over 2 centuries. The vote passed. The override initiated, and within moments, the tribunal system blanked. Then a single line appeared. Clause 7.4d, Terran oversight retained during emergency protocols. The lights dimmed slightly. The chamber temperature lowered 2 degrees. Nobody stood. Back on the outer ports, civilian transports arriving at neutral stations began experiencing unrecognized transit pings. Their hull tags, once freely accepted, now looped back into historical record audits. Each flag cross-referenced with diplomatic relic codes sourced from old Earth trade forums. Without any orders issued, dock controllers began denying entry. Their systems weren't overridden, they were obeying rules embedded in station firmware. Rules validated during the Concorde's peak, still active, never challenged. On Lyric Station, a freighter captain threw his badge across the control terminal, yelling at the port official who'd just denied him clearance for the 4th time. "I'm carrying medical supply stockpiles. If those don't land, people die." The port controller, a former Assembly loyalist, shook his head, tight-lipped. "The dock won't accept non-verified ID. And the ID says Earth holds review status. I can't override it. It won't take mine." The captain's hands trembled as he looked back at his crew. "Then who can override it?" The answer came not in words, but in the absence of any. Back in the Assembly's central chamber, the silence had returned. But this time, it didn't belong to contemplation. It belonged to fear. They could no longer govern their systems. They could no longer move their fleets. They could no longer direct their infrastructure. And Earth had issued no threat, made no demand, drawn no blood. Only laws, long forgotten, now awakened. Laws they had signed, and laws that, without consent or enforcement, now ruled them completely. The first fleet to go dark was the Kyrex 4th Line, stationed near the Vescaran Rift. It began with a simple systems check. Weapons Officer Drell was running diagnostic cycles on the forward turrets when the console refused input. The interface didn't lock, it flickered, paused, then presented a message never before seen on military architecture. Firing controls suspended. Clause Delta Black active. He tried again, overriding from the secondary pathway. The system didn't resist. It acknowledged his command, then returned the same verdict. It was not malfunction. It was enforcement. Aboard the command bridge, Admiral Brex Halros gripped the railing with both hands as comms began pouring in. Each ship in his formation reported identical status. Weapon systems inert, targeting matrices sealed. Authorization levels redirected to compliance review nodes that no longer sat under Assembly control. "Try fallback codes," he ordered, voice rasped from restraint. Deny the override chain. Trigger default combat authority. Do it now. The officers complied. Commands fed into the core system. Responses came back in identical order. Locked by Earth oversight, Varos stepped away from the console, heartbeat hammering beneath his collar. We haven't declared war. We haven't fired a shot. The fleet had, but not at Earth. Not once. And yet here they stood, disabled, dismissed by a clause none of them remembered agreeing to, one buried so deep in trade documents and reconstruction contracts that even their legal division hadn't recognized the structure until it executed. Down on the surface of Grell Station, security teams assigned to planetary stabilization ran routine weapons drills. Mid-exercise stun rifles failed to arm. Combat harnesses blinked red across all squads. Emergency lockers refused access. Attempts to force manual authorization triggered alerts, non-hostile ones, notices, policy flags, each filed under Earth Compliance Watchdog Index. Captain Viren slammed his sidearm onto the wall console and stared at the regulation sheet that scrolled in response. Clause February 7th, 14? Since when does Earth regulate internal arms clearance on Grell? The answer came from the floor technician, sweat beading across his forehead. Since they paid for Grell's orbital elevator 23 years ago, the loan guarantee required doctrinal fallback compliance. If the lender triggers a recall clause, emergency control reverts. You mean Earth? I mean, Thesaron, the tech said quietly. And it just finished executing Delta Protocol? Within hours, 31 assembly worlds reported similar events. Communications jammed not by interference, but by filtration. Only messages deemed strategically neutral passed through the compliance layer. Military logistics feeds collapsed entirely, diverted for clause review, and no legal body could override the filtration layer. Because every override attempted became subject to the same law that triggered the shutdown in the first place. Legal departments across faction capitals went into crisis mode. War councils were interrupted by compliance auditors who carried no weapons, wore no uniforms but walked into command centers and simply disconnected consoles. Not one was denied. Their authorization, burned into treaty architecture, superseded all titles. The councils couldn't stop them. They'd signed the documents themselves. In the low-orbit command bay above Virex Tar, Judge Advocate Troll Nork sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by decades-old paper treaties now marked in red. "This wasn't retaliation," he whispered to his clerk, hands trembling above the page. "This was installation. They didn't bury weapons. They planted governance." The clerk remained still, holding a fragment of a discarded data slab recovered from the destroyed Earth embassy. It had survived fire, pressure, and purge sweeps. It bore no circuitry, just etched text. Earth Doctrine Tablet, Delta Series, Clause, Black. They scanned it. The file reassembled itself into legal structure. Not code, not malware. Law. Signed by the Assembly 76 years ago under humanitarian aid expansion legislation, one that granted Earth remote arbitration authority in the event of intergalactic collapse or systemic sabotage. In that moment, Troll Nork stopped seeing Earth as a power. He saw it as a framework. On Corellon Prime, a riot formed near the planetary customs bay as independent traders attempted to bypass locked docking arms. The arms didn't hold them physically. They simply refused to activate the final release sequence. No override worked. One merchant attempted to hotwire the manual override node. It didn't reject him. It executed the clause. Unauthorized release detected. Contract nullified. His entire vessel decommissioned itself in dock. Cargo frozen. ID revoked. Digital identity flagged as in breach of Earth-verified freight integrity. He screamed until his voice broke. Inside the assembly crisis bunker, Dranex Vol stood before the last functioning central table. His face was lined with exhaustion, his movements slow, deliberate. "Every directive we wrote has been mirrored," he said. "Every law we passed, every charter we issued, copied, embedded, restructured with fallback mechanisms we never thought anyone would invoke. He turned to Threxen, who stood across the room, still and silent. "We handed them the pen," Vol continued, "and they used it to write the last chapter of our own authority." Threxen's voice, when it came, was quiet. "This isn't war." "No," Vol replied. "This is conclusion, executed by clause." The final report of the day came not from a diplomat, not from a soldier, but from a private analyst contracted by the Federation Legal Registry. He submitted a single page with the following message: "Thesion is not an AI. It is a legal executor housed in every assembly code formatting system deployed after year 19 of Concord standardization. Deactivation requires revoking the formatting structure itself. If attempted, all systems built on that format will cease function permanently." The page ended with a single line: "Earth's weapon was not military. It was legal permanence." And from that point forward, no one in the assembly ever issued another override. They understood the truth. They hadn't lost control. They had surrendered it. Years ago, all Earth did was reclaim it, with the clause they'd forgotten to delete. The assembly floor was already crowded when the broadcast system lit green. The room, once built to accommodate 90 sovereign seats, now overflowed with advisors, aides, and tactical liaisons whose own chain of command had collapsed 3 sessions ago. Delegates stood instead of sitting, not out of respect, but because none of their consoles had accepted input since morning. A voice from the left side of the chamber rose above the churn. "Where is the Earth envoy?" demanded Councillor Dresk from the Myron Pact. His neck ridges flared as he pointed toward the unlit Terran chair across the span. "We called this assembly under sovereign order. They will answer for the disruption they've engineered." No one responded. The Earth seat remained unoccupied, its console dark, panel sealed, badge untouched. It hadn't been accessed in 53 years. Still, the seat itself hadn't been removed. No one ever voted to dissolve their membership, only to suspend it. That minor administrative detail now sat like a judicial spear in the center of the room. Dranex Vol stood near the upper tier, arms crossed, jaw set. He hadn't spoken once since arrival. His eyes stayed fixed on the chamber's main wall as the internal clock struck midday. Across all decks, the upper domed interface adjusted brightness by 1 interval. A single click echoed from the speakers above. The console beneath the Terran seat activated on its own. No one touched it. No delegate logged access. No encryption keys were entered. And yet, the broadcast began. The screen behind the chamber pulsed once before revealing a seated figure. Human, male, graying at the temples, formal attire crisply fitted to a bygone diplomatic standard. Behind him, the insignia of the old Concord shimmered faintly. Below it, embossed in black, the seal of Earth. The man didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge anyone watching. He began speaking as if the audience had never left. "I am Ren Varos," he said, voice steady, unhurried. "Former representative to the Organic Assembly. Architect of the Severance Accords. Author of Icarus Red." Half the chamber froze in place. Varos continued, unwavering. "When we withdrew, we left behind this archive. You assumed it was a record. You treated it like a monument. You misunderstood. This archive was not a gift. It was your test." He paused only briefly, just long enough to allow the weight of his words to drop into the bones of every listening delegate. "You passed your verdict when you nullified our protocols. The moment you deleted them, the clause structure inverted. Every system that once required Earth's consent now demands Earth's authority. Not because we seized it, but because you violated the framework that kept it dormant." At that exact moment, Fleet Command nodes across 71 star systems shifted status. Control interfaces dimmed, not as an error but as a handover. Bridge officers watched helplessly as targeting arrays flickered offline and main drives defaulted to stand-down sequences. No explosions followed, no ships fired. They couldn't. Manual overrides presented request prompts labeled awaiting Terran Directive. Back in the chamber, Varos resumed. We designed Icarus Red with no weapons. No firewalls. No viral code. Only law, ratified, signed, codified by your own hands. The archive did not breach your sovereignty. Your signatures did. Aides in the chamber scrambled to shut down the feed. The system denied all input. The interface ignored cancel commands. One technician tried to sever the power node. The console replied with a lockout notice, sourced from Earth's embassy charter. Still recognized as active under assembly maintenance code. On the screen, Varos leaned forward once, just enough to focus every pair of eyes. You believed Earth departed because we were weakened. We left because we understood the lifespan of empires. We didn't need conquest. We needed compliance. And you ensured it. A tremor passed through the room. Not from motion, but comprehension. A screen on the far wall switched to tactical view by automatic sync. It displayed the cumulative power grid distribution across assembly warfleets. 72% of them now read offline. Not destroyed. Not corrupted. Reclassified. Varos's eyes didn't harden. They didn't soften. They remained exact, as if every word had been drafted years in advance. You were warned, not by us, by your own laws. We wrote the end into your beginning. The archive merely remembered. The video ended. There was no closing statement. The screen went black. The Terran console powered down. For the first time in the chamber's operational history, no delegate spoke. No proposal followed. No motion was made. Every screen in the room displayed one uniform notification. Compliance status. Earth oversight active. Awaiting further directive. In orbit above Gax 4, Admiral Rattan issued an emergency power-up cycle to his fleet. The consoles refused. The software denied manual control. He reached for his personal sidearm in frustration. It clicked, once. The interface beneath it displayed a notification. Usage restricted under clause Delta Black. Rattan lowered the weapon slowly. Not out of fear, out of final understanding. He turned to his officers and said one sentence. BP1 without moving. Clerk Jatve leaned over the desk terminal, his breath hitching as the legal interface froze mid-command. He had initiated the treaty withdrawal exactly as instructed. Standard protocol, sector-backed, full legislative sign-off. Yet the response blinked once, then returned an impossible verdict. Withdrawal invalid, charter-dependent systems engaged. He rechecked the entry. No typos, no missing seals. The signature verification had passed. Still, the response locked into the system like a deadbolt. Behind him, the room buzzed with others doing the same. Paperwork flew. Treaty folders were ripped apart. Emergency override credentials flashed in front of scanners with increasing urgency. None succeeded. A colleague whispered over his shoulder, "Vey, every charter we've tied into since year 28 relies on Earth's formatting index." Vey stood frozen. Then how do we separate? The other clerk didn't answer. He just stepped back, defeated, and erased his draft entirely. In orbit above Drenthal Station, Captain Erlon Deck viewed his fleet manifest on a cracked monitor that wouldn't refresh. All docking clamps on their cargo vessels remained shut, the status blinking, "Stand by, awaiting, compliance resolution." When he tried to open a manual release on docking arm 7, a new message flashed in amber. "Request denied. Terran oversight pending." He struck the console with the side of his hand. One of his crew members ducked around a corner, holding a bundled emergency ration crate. Dak didn't speak. He simply pointed to the starboard viewport. 4 other freighters hovered, fully stocked, unmoving, unfueled. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't even protest. The ships remained still because they couldn't respond to orders. Their command systems had buried themselves under fallback compliance clauses. Across the planet's surface, port authorities tried to revert to legacy communication relays, only to find the infrastructure no longer recognized local broadcast bands. Their channels blinked a single note at the top of each cycle. Earth oversight activated. Interplanetary transmission filter applied. Minister Vorik of the Zarnari Assembly reviewed her planet's energy draw history with growing horror. The moment they declared formal separation from the organic concord, the atmospheric stabilizers began to lose sync. The main planetary shield grid, developed under a human-administered tech-sharing program decades ago, required compliance renewals signed through now-expired Earth-affiliated credentials. The generator interface wouldn't take her override key. It wanted a document Earth had issued 50 years prior. She stared at the blank screen as her aide ran in, hands trembling. Food transport from Olvari was turned away. They flagged our fleet as unauthorized under Charter Code 22X. They said the cargo was conditional. Conditional on what? Vorik asked, the words catching in her throat. Earth verification. She closed the screen without replying. On the fringe colony of Talmare, Junior Coordinator Dev Tans tried to reactivate Defense Grid Beta after 3 local towers failed power sync. He cycled the entire system. The response came instantly. Local defense activation unavailable. Doctrinal rollback in progress. He shouted over the comms at his superior. They're rolling back doctrines, not tech. Who gave them this much access? The voice crackled back. We did. When we adopted the terraforming framework. We accepted their fallback clauses as default planetary structure. It's not sabotage, it's enforcement. Dev didn't speak again. He just stepped back from the panel and looked out over the field, where unharvested crops browned under a failing temperature shield. In the orbiting transit lanes, a freight hauler marked Yurtel Consortium ran out of fuel, waiting for docking authorization. Its crew hadn't eaten in 3 days. The station above them responded once with a default message. Docking currently unavailable. Fleet ID not recognized under active compliance set. The message included a footnote. Earth conditional access required. In a quiet corridor beneath Assembly District 10, 5 clerks stood around a fire barrel where treaty copies burned. Paperwork, once sacred, turned to ash. One of them, a gray-skinned senior processor named Jarn Molt, threw in the last copy of their fleet authorization charter. They built the system, we just filled it in. Another clerk shook his head. We didn't just fill it, we fed it. Somewhere in the dark of space, planetary broadcasts that once bore dozens of emblems now blinked only one, the archive insignia. It didn't demand surrender, it didn't broadcast intent, it simply replaced the standard channel header with the phrase, compliance status, minus in effect. At the edge of the Milvax belt, a small transport ship attempted to manually ignite its core thrusters. The interface prompted for command override. The pilot entered his personal key. The screen returned. Fuel access denied. Charter terminated. His co-pilot slumped in the seat beside him. So we're not stranded because of blockade? No, the pilot said, voice cracking. We're stranded because we stopped being valid. Back on the surface of Yevra, civilian ration stations shut down after their auto-logistics inventory sync failed to update. The systems weren't destroyed. They were fully intact. But without Terran formatting structures, the automated process refused to verify item codes. Mothers screamed at distribution drones that no longer recognized familial registries. Children waited behind barricades that didn't need to fall apart. They just needed no signal to proceed. By the close of the 7th day, 14 planetary governments issued conditional statements of autonomy surrender, each signed under emergency protocol, to resume Earth-approved formatting. Not one of them asked for protection. They asked for permission. Earth never answered. It didn't need to. Their systems had already responded. Not with war, not with conquest, but with absence. The kind of absence that empties a system of function, not by threat, but by revoking its right to exist. The final vote was not recorded in the Assembly's registry. No quorum, no formalities, no quorum validation ceremony. They simply stopped meeting. Chamber lights remained dim. Monitors blinked on schedule with no requests to process. Dust gathered across curved nameplates, no longer updated. The diplomatic table, once the fulcrum of policy and war, was left untouched. Seats cold, console keys inactive, Terran chair still unclaimed. Not one representative attempted to sit in it. 4 weeks after the last compliance notification, the organic assembly dissolved itself without ceremony. Some tried to hold adjacent forums, regional panels, faction summits. None succeeded. Without shared formatting protocols, their resolutions carried no legal weight. There were no signatures, only denials. Authority had evacuated the room and hadn't returned. The council scribe sealed the doors for the final time. He pressed the panel to disable hall access and watched the interface reject his command. Instead, it returned a single message in pale gray. Directive. Icarus completion verified. On the surface of Veltrax, former Marshal Gron stood before his burned charter vault, its metal frame still hot, insulation curling at the corners. His troops had abandoned the base 2 days earlier. Not from defeat, but from inability to function. Their systems had disconnected one by one. Weapons, food replicators, command panels, each had accepted no commands, citing revoked credentials issued under Earth's now reactivated frameworks. He looked up at the skies. No warships, no Earth fleet, just an automated drone that passed every morning, scanned for authorization, and moved on. It never stopped. It never responded. Somewhere on the border of the Keldari Rim, 7 species signed a new compact. It was brief, stripped of ceremony. They included one line at the end. Not a clause, not a demand, just a legal echo. All signatories recognize Earth compliance oversight as a structural requirement for treaty stability. The words weren't debated. No one objected. They had seen what happened without them. On the 3rd floor of the Council Archives Museum, behind reinforced glass, the Earth Archive core now sat on display. It no longer transmitted. Its uplinks had gone dormant after directive completion. But the display remained intact. The label, mounted above it, read, "The final mechanism of structured sovereignty collapse. Terran Archive. Icarus series." Visitors arrived daily, their eyes drawn not to the display but to the exhibit beside it. A sealed case held a single folded uniform. Sleeves creased, nameplate scuffed, insignia faint from age. The inscription below read, Ross Velron, the last assembly systems engineer who attempted to manually override Klaus Delta Black. Date of failure? 2 hours before complete jurisdictional collapse. A boy stood before the exhibit, his father beside him. The child tapped the glass. Why didn't they just stop it? The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed on the archive. Because they didn't think it was active. They thought it was history. Across 3 dozen systems, emergency rations were restored under new conditional networks. Each shipment contained a signature seal. Unreadable, but universally accepted. The recipients never questioned the authority. They only cared that the systems worked again. At the edge of the Udron belt, a new diplomatic complex opened. Small, neutral, transparent governance. It bore no weapons, it had no fleet, but at the heart of its server rack sat a redundant compliance verification core. Built on Terran format architecture, during the press briefing, the lead mediator of the complex gave a single, closing remark. Function, not fear, maintains order. In the secure archival vault buried beneath Earth's southern continent, the original transmission record of Ren Varos was filed away under cold storage. The storage clerk who handled the transfer paused to read the final line of the document. BEXS the archive to study history. Instead, they triggered their own deletion. He logged it, sealed the container, and walked out. The door closed behind him. No lock clicked. It didn't need to. Above Earth, the orbital monitoring station ran a silent diagnostic cycle. No alerts, no disruptions. The system pinged all known Earth-linked infrastructures across the galaxy. Every ping returned affirmative. No commands were issued. There was no need. Everything now functioned under law. Not belief. Not power. Law written in advance, signed by those who laughed and never withdrawn. Somewhere, deep in an old diplomatic hall, someone had once said the archive was dead. They were wrong. It was simply waiting. What would you have done if your enemy turned law into a weapon and never lifted a finger to fight? Tell us in the comments, was Earth's strategy justice or something far colder? And while you're here, which HFY story should we break down next? Let us know below. If this shook you, like, subscribe, and stay tuned.